Sewing knits and jerseys is completely different to sewing woven fabrics. If you've not done it before, you might be wondering what are the best techniques to use. I'm Ali and I've been dressmaking for over 30 years, and I'm going to break down all the basics you need to know to sew seams, trims, hems, everything you'll need for a basic jersey garment. As well as this video, I've also written a blog with all the details, so you can refer to that if you want to remember which stitches to use where. This is the first of 3 tutorials I'm making. So this one shows how to sew the fabric, then I'm going to show you how to cut a block to make a t-shirt like this, and then the third one is how to actually make this whole t-shirt. So as you can see, I've got 3 different machines behind me. I'm going to show you how to get the perfect finish using a cover stitch machine and an overlocker, and I'm also going to show you alternatives on a regular sewing machine. It doesn't need to be a computerized machine like this. Any sewing machine, you'll be able to get this kind of finish. So before you start, a couple of things to think about. If you're making things from jersey, I always recommend pre-washing it because jersey does tend to shrink a fair bit, certainly a lot more than a woven. So just wash it on the cycle you're going to be washing it on in the future, and give it a good press as well. And just when you're cutting it out, make sure it's going in the right direction. So you want the stretch going across. You can get jerseys that stretch in both directions, but if it just stretches one way, you want that going across, and it's the direction that it's knitted in. So make sure you pre-wash it and get it the right way round. And then the other thing is your needle. A ballpoint needle is perfect for jersey. It's not sharp, so it doesn't pierce the actual fabric. It has a ballpoint and it kind of goes between the fibres, so it doesn't pierce it, which is what you want. And also make sure you don't have a blunt needle. I know that sounds funny if I'm saying you want a ballpoint one that's not sharp, but you also don't want it blunt because it can skip stitches, snag the fabric, all of those things. So just make sure you've got a good needle. Okay, so I'm going to do this in sections. I'll look at seams, then I'll look at hems, and then I will look at trims. But before we get started, let's have a look at this t-shirt on the table and look at how I've put it all together. So before we get started with any sewing, let's just have a look at all the basic parts of the t-shirt at what we'll be looking at. So you've obviously got seams on the armholes, the shoulders and the sides. And then you've got the hems at the bottom and on the sleeves, and then some form of neck trim. Obviously there's a lot more variations than this, but let's just look at a basic t-shirt. So let's have a look on the inside. So let's first look at the seams. So the main seams are on the sides and on the shoulders, which puts the whole of the body together, and the sleeves as well. And the general order that you make it on a t-shirt or on a knit is you do the shoulder, then you sew the sleeve on when it's flat, and then you do this side seam all in one piece up the side of the body and into the sleeve, rather than how you might have done on wovens where you do the body and the sleeve and then put the sleeve in as one. So that's the general way of doing that. And then the hems, the best way to finish it is if you've got a cover stitch machine, in which case you do this process all in one go. So I'll show you how to do that, and I'll show you alternatives if you don't have that machine, as I'm guessing most people don't. And then finally the neck trim from the inside. So this has been overlocked on and then top stitched using a cover stitch machine. So you can see that that's got stretch. The last thing you want to do is sew any of this on a regular stitch on a regular machine, because nothing will have stretch. All of these seams and all of these hems stretch where you need them to. So back to the outside of my t-shirt. I'm going to show you how to do the seams. If you've got an overlocker, then that is ideal, but there are some alternatives. So I'll show you the best way first to get the most professional finish, and then I'll show you some alternatives on a basic sewing machine that you can do on any basic sewing machine that you're going to buy. So before we start sewing any machines, this is just a regular stitch on a regular machine, and you can see that on a t-shirt there's no stretch to this at all. It's not going to work. You're either going to end up with a t-shirt that just looks quite shabby, or it's actually going to snap as you put it on. So that's basically just what to avoid. You really don't want to be using that stitch. So let's have a look now at how you should be sewing a seam. So in an ideal world, if you're sewing knits, you're going to have an overlocker. So I'm using a 4-thread overlocker. I've got 2 needles. And the great thing about this is you don't need to do reverse stitches. You can just get sewing and you can just stop at the end. So mine's got various settings, stitch length, you can do it on curves, things like that. This is a pretty old machine. I've had this over 20 years, but it shows just how well built this machine is that I'm still using it. So that's why it might look a little bit old-fashioned maybe, and a little bit tatty. I've got all my threads caught now. So I'm gonna sew this with a contrast thread so you can really see what's going on. So let's just zoom in a little bit so you can see more closely what's going on. So I've basically got 2 threads that are going to the needles, and they go through these tension dials, and then the other 2 needles go from these ones which are underneath here, and then they all work together to do the overlocking. So let's just zoom in a little bit more, and hopefully you can see roughly what's going on. I can't get very near my machine because I have a camera away, but hopefully I'm staying nice and straight. So it's basically finishing off the seam so it doesn't fray or anything like that, and it's sewing it all up all at the same time. So if you have got an overlocker, this is obviously the way to go. It does everything all in one go. You get a really neat finish. It's not gonna, as you're wearing it, start to come apart, and it's actually just really quick as well. So if I was making something using this, I would then just give it a little press while I'm making it, but you can see it's a perfect finish, and it's got some stretch as well. I've obviously not got as much stretch going in this direction, but you can see it's not affecting that stretch at all. It's a perfectly stretchy stitch. So I'll show you now on a basic machine how you can imitate this if you don't have an overlocker. So let's have a look now on a standard machine what we can do. I've already shown you the basic stitch, how it just doesn't allow any stretch at all. If we look at the natural stretch of the fabric, you can see straight away it stops it stretching. So there are several alternatives. So I'm going to show you on this computerized machine that I've got, but I'm going to show you stitches that you're going to get on most basic sewing machines. So let's have a look first at a regular stretch stitch. Now let's try and zoom in, see if you can see on here nice and easily. So this is the symbol here for the standard stretch stitch. So you see it's got 3 lines, which shows that it sews, it goes back on itself and it sews again. So that is a good version that I'll show you. And this one, which is like a narrow zigzag stitch that slightly goes back on itself, also called a lightning stitch. I'm going to show you that. And then you can also use the basic zigzags and play around with the widths. So knit fabrics don't fray like woven fabrics, so you don't have to worry about overlocking the edges. But if you do want to get that overlock finish, just so it looks a bit nicer on the inside, I'll also show you how to do the stitch on this machine that imitates an overlock stitch. So the first one I'm going to do, and I'm not going to do it on a seam, I'm just going to do it just straight on this fabric, because then we can compare the stretch of the stitches nice and easily. So the first one I'm going to sew next to this, just for a real straightforward comparison. In fact, let's move over a little bit, is the standard stretch stitch. So this is a stitch that stitches, goes back and stitches again, and it allows it to stretch. So the machine has automatically selected the stitch length for me, which is 2.5. and I'm using just the regular foot. So let's have a look. I'll turn the speed down on my machine so you can see really clearly. So it's going forward, backwards, forward, and then forwards, backwards, forwards. And hopefully you can see that. You can kind of see the fabric going backwards and forwards. So it's quite a small stitch because you don't want a big stitch, because it's just not going to give it a good finish. So I'll speed the machine up now, or we're going to be here all day. And now let's take this off and see how much stretch it has. So let's look at these together. So that's just the basic stitch. You can see there's no stretch in that at all. And then this is the basic stretch stitch. It doesn't leave as much stretch as the fabric, but it's certainly a lot more stretchy than this. This doesn't give you any stretch at all. And actually, if I pull that like this, it gives you a fair bit of stretch. So it is a little bit heavier, but if you want to keep your stitch line dead straight rather than a zigzag, then that's a good option to use. So let's have a look at the zigzag versions as well. So this time I'll do it as an actual seam. So this is the lightning stitch. This is the one that is a zigzag, but it kind of goes back on itself and it's very narrow. So this is a good one to use for a seam, because the more wide your zigzag is, the less straight your seam's going to look. So I don't know how well you can see that. Let's zoom in a little bit more, and I'll just slow the machine down again. And let's see if you can see what's going on. So it's just, you can see the needle is going slightly left and right, and it's just going back and forth that way as well. So we'll have a closer look in a second. Let's speed this up. So here we are. You can see that it's not 100% straight like a basic stitch, but it's not as bulky as the stretch stitch. And you can see it allows my fabric to stretch, and then on the right side it actually just looks like a straight seam. So that's a really good option to go with if you're using a standard machine. In fact, if I was using a standard machine and I didn't have an overlocker, I think this is probably what I would go with. And then let's just have a quick look at a regular zigzag as well. So I'm just going to sew a little bit of a regular zigzag here, and I've set this at a stitch width of 3 and a stitch length of 1.5. So let's just see how that compares. It's actually quite wide, so just let's do that a little bit narrower as well, and we can look at both of them together. And there we are, that's the zigzag next to it. So obviously that has plenty of stretch because the stitch can stretch out as we use it. And when I made it narrower, you can see it started off quite wide, and it's not going to give you a great seam. And I've made it narrower here, so that was on a stitch width of 2. I don't know if every machine is going to be the same, but that's what I set this to, with a stitch length of 1.5. And actually that's fairly straight, and that looks pretty good from the other side. Obviously when you're sewing it in the right colour, you're not going to see these stitches. So that's a great one as well for letting you have some stretch and keeping the seam looking pretty straight. You can see there, that's the wider one, and actually it doesn't look that different. So the best thing is just to play around with the different options. I'm going to show you now this one, which also goes over the edge, which imitates the stitch on the overlocker machine the most. So for this one, because my machine is computerized, it's automatically set my stitch length to 2.5 and the width to 5, and it's told me to use this foot. So this is labelled C, so I'm guessing any Janome machine, if I put it over the green, you might be able to see it better. I can only assume that any Janome machine is going to be a C foot, exactly the same, but this is what it looks like, which helps me to sew it going over the edge. So I've zoomed in on this as much as I can. So if I point on here, this foot's got like a little bit that goes down here, which sits at the edge of the fabric. And then there's 2 little metal, they look like the size of a needle. I don't know what I'd call them. They're not metal rods. They're just little bits of metal here. And that helps it all stay in place when your needle does what it's going to do. So I've put the machine on the slowest speed so you can see really well. It's set everything up for me. So let's just see. Oh, I think I've knocked my tripod. Let's just see what it does. So let's go nice and slow. So it's going to the left, and then those 2 bits of metal hold it in place when it goes over to the right. And what it's doing by having those 2 little bits of metal there, it's stopping the zigzag from bunching up. It's keeping it nice and flat. So I'm just going to sew it really slowly so you can see. So you can see it's doing a few stitches at the left, and it's going backwards and forwards like the first stretch stitch that I showed you, and then it's going to the right, and then it's holding it all in place using those bars. So let's speed it up a little bit. That's the great thing about this machine, I can do different speeds, and then we can see how this looks. Make sure you don't stretch your fabric as you're sewing it. And that's how it looks. So if I get the overlock seam, it actually looks pretty similar. It's a little bit narrower, so you do need to think about what the width of things like this are when you're doing your seam allowance. But you can see it's a really similar look, and it goes over the edge the same. So just be careful not to stretch it as you sew it. But once I give this a little bit of a steam, it's all going to shrink back in place anyway. And if we look at the other side, it looks pretty good. Again, once it's pressed, that's going to look really neat and pretty strong. And most importantly, it's got loads of stretch. So that is a really good option as well. So for me, number 1 absolutely is the overlocking. it gives a perfect finish and it's really quick and easy to do. And number 2 option for me, depending on how bulky your fabric is and what you're making, would either be the lightning stitch, which was this one that I showed you here, which has got plenty of stretch and it's a fairly narrow stitch, narrower than the basic zigzag, or this, both really good options. And failing that, if you don't have the option of those stitches, then a narrow zigzag, which I'm pretty sure any sewing machine would do, even if it's a very basic, very old machine. I know my mum's old 1960s Singer used to have this stitch that I learned on back in the 80s, so you're definitely going to be able to do that. So quite a few options for the basic seam. I hope you found that helpful with the seams. Now that we've done those, let's have a look at the hems and different ways of getting a great finish for your jersey hems. So this is my cover stitch machine. I deliberated for ages whether to buy this machine because it felt like a real indulgence. However, I'm so glad I bought it because I could never get a professional finish. You can get a good finish on a regular machine, but this gives an absolutely perfect finish, just like you would see any t-shirt hem in a shop. So you've got the option here of 2, 3, or 1 needle. So the twin needle is for basic hems. You can do a 3 needle if you want a more decorative hem, and then the single needle is for doing, well, you can do a hem with it, or it's for doing things like top stitch around neck trims, things like that. So that's the options of the needles there. These are the 3 tension dials for the top threads here, and then there's a further one here which goes underneath here and it loops backwards and forwards. I don't know if loop is the right word, but that's how it works. If I just move that, you can see this bit here. Oh, I've got a lot of fluff under there. I think I better give that a clean, haven't I? So that's how that works. So I've threaded this up again in a contrast thread. So let's have a look at this working. So I've got nice and close so you can see what's going on. I've got red this time. It feels a bit like Christmas today using green and red. So I'm not gonna worry about how the underneath of this is for now. I just want to show what the basic stitch is. So I'm using this to line it up. I don't even know if this came with this machine or it came with a different machine, but this is to line my fabric up against, and it's perfect for keeping the stitch line to the edge nice and parallel. So I've got this set on a stitch length of 2.5, and I've got the wide of the twin needles, so sometimes it gets a little bit caught up behind, but all you do is lift the foot up and then you can pull that out. So I've got my needles, if I pull them to the top, set quite wide. You can do them narrower as well, but when I show you how to properly finish it off, you'll see why I like them wider, because finishing it off with the narrow one is a little bit more fiddly. So what I'm doing is I'm just letting it bunch up and then lifting the foot up literally a tiny bit to release it, because what I don't want to do is pull this through. I don't want to stretch anything as I'm sewing. The stitch has naturally got stretch. It doesn't need me to stretch it anymore. So you don't do a reverse on this. All I'm going to do is kind of tease that out, and then I go underneath and I have to just kind of pull these threads. So if anyone has a cover stitch machine and they're not getting on with it, then please let me know in the comments, because I can do a separate video just about the cover stitch machine. So I'm just going to trim those, and then I don't want any of them to come out of the needles, so I'm just pulling them through, and that's ready to go again in a second. And that's how it looks. So I couldn't really get to my sewing machine very well, which is why it's a little bit wonky, but when I've got a tripod and a phone in the way filming it, it's a bit tricky. So that's how it looks from the right side, just how you'd expect any hem to be on a t-shirt, and that's how it looks behind. So you can either sew it like that and then just obviously add a little bit of seam allowance on and then just trim that really short, or the other option is to make sure this lines up perfectly underneath. So if I want it to perfectly keep that raw edge between the stitching, I need to measure from the left needle to where this guide is here. So that's 2 centimetres. And then what I need to do is I need to fold my fabric up just under 2 centimetres. So I've pinned this up now. And when I say less than 2 centimetres, it's literally a millimetre less than 2 centimetres. So that's the wrong side. And then this is the side that I want to sew it. So all I'm going to do is just switch those needles to be pointing the way that I'm sewing, now that I can see from this side. And then I just need to get it in the right place and sew down there. So again, I can't get very close to my machine while I'm demonstrating, so hopefully I can sew it in a straight line. Let's see how that works. And hopefully you can see on there, hopefully I haven't got so close it's blurry, you can see that the edge of the fabric, that's the right side, the edge of the fabric is perfectly positioned between the two needles, so you don't get any fabric hanging out at all, and obviously you still got your stretch. So the kind of hem that I would recommend if you don't have a cover stitch machine is a twin needle on a regular machine. So as far as I'm aware, you can buy these twin needles at any sewing machine shop. And it basically does the twin needle at the top. They're a little bit narrower than the cover stitch machine, although I think you can get them in various widths. And then you've got the thread at the bottom that just zigzags across just like on the cover stitch machine. So I've set this to a stitch length of 2.6. So let's see how this sews. And I'm going to sew nice and slow because I don't want to accidentally stretch it. So let's see how that looks. And obviously the twin needle is perfectly spaced because the needle does that for me. And you can see on the back, you just get this little zigzag. Let's zoom out a bit because I think that's a bit out of focus. So this means that it's still got its stretch because it's got that zigzag, which is great. Looks great from the outside, needs a little bit of a press. And then I can just trim off my fabric to where it needs to be, or you can just make sure you've got the right amount to start with. So you can overlock the fabric edge first if you have an overlocker, but otherwise you can use the overlock stitch on the sewing machine that I showed before and then do this kind of hem. There's plenty of variations that you can play around with. A lot of what you decide to do for hems if you're using a basic sewing machine is you need to decide based on how heavy the fabric is, how drapey it is, all of those things. So that is the first option that I would always recommend if you can do it. And let's have a look at a couple of other options. Another good option is a blind hem. So this is the blind hem foot that comes with my machine. This is a G foot. Again, not sure if that is a universal thing for all Janome machines. And I know other brand machines might look slightly different, but you'll be able to do it. So I folded this. So I do have a separate tutorial for a blind hem if you want a little bit more detail about how this works. But I just wanted to show you how it looks on the jersey. Obviously you would want to use a matching thread, but it always shows up better for tutorials if I don't do that. So I'm trying my hardest not to stretch this, although I feel like I'm stretching it a little bit. But let's just finish this off and then see how it looks. But the way the stitch is done means it has a bit of stretch. So that's how it was when I was sewing it. So it's sewing across here and just doing one little stitch, picking up the bit on the left. That's how it looks when it's folded out. You can always trim that seam allowance after. And then from the right side, you just see that little stitch, which if that was in red, you wouldn't really notice it. And most importantly, you've got the stretch that you need. So that's a great alternative that you can do on, I'm sure, any sewing machine. And then finally, I've just put the regular foot back on and I'm just going to show a couple of zigzag stitches. So I'm not going to go too wide on my zigzag. So this is just a basic one that's a stitch width of 3.5. And you're always going to have some stretch when you use a zigzag. It's just getting the size that you want. It's more of a decorative stitch, but it does the job. So that's the basic zigzag. And then I'm going to use, I've got to admit, I don't actually know the name of this one, but it's a zigzag. I'm going to set it to the same width where you've got 3 little stitches going across. I've gone too far. 3 little stitches going across either way. So if I do it slowly, you can see what I mean. So we've got, it always starts itself off. So 1, 2, 3 going that way. 1, 2, 3 going that way. So speed it up. And this is the kind of stitch you sometimes see on stretch edges on things like swimwear and underwear. So there we go, there's the 2 different zigzags. Didn't realise I'd quite sewn so much of one and not of the other. So that's just the basic zigzag. It's got some great stretch and it's a nice neat little stitch and actually looks quite nice in the contrast. And then this one, I don't know how close I can get without it going blurry. But you can see it's got the 3 little stitches either way, and I always think that just looks like a really nice stitch as well. So that's a couple of great options for, I mean, you can see it's got absolutely heaps of stretch, and this is why they use this stitch on underwear, swimwear, stuff like that. Looking at all these together, this is the cover stitch hem, which is the most professional finish you're going to get. There's the twin needle with the little zigzag behind it, and then the blind hem, the regular zigzag, and the zigzag that does it in 3 stitches. I really need to look up the name of that. Please tell me below in the comments if you know the actual name for that. I feel a bit silly not knowing it. So that's all the options, and they all have plenty of stretch. I guess that one has the most, although actually the zigzags are pretty similar. So they're all really good options. And we are nearly done now. We've got the seams and the hems done. Let's have a look at the trims, because you can't finish off a garment without knowing how to get a perfect trim. So finally, the neck. This is the bit that I can only assume, if you've not done it before, seems like it might be really tricky. It's actually pretty straightforward. So I've just got a piece of folded fabric. So I'm using 2 colours to show it really clearly. So I'm folding that with the right side on the outside and those edges together. And it needs to go on my curve. So I've not cut this any particular size. I have just cut a curve and a strip just to demonstrate it. And I want to get that on there. And what I need to do, this will all come down to making the pattern and getting this the right size. What you don't want to do is cut your trim to fit this bit here. You need to cut the trim for the size of the actual opening and then stretch it on this side here where the seam is to fit onto here. So I'm going to be doing a t-shirt tutorial very shortly. So if you're watching this a couple of weeks after I've posted this video, then it will already be up. And in that video, I will show a lot of detail of how to do this. So basically, I'm putting this on here, and this is what I'm saying. If you, let me just pin it quickly. I just want to give you a rough idea of how this works without going into too much detail. So if I pin this on here and I don't stretch it on, so you'll probably guess how this is going to look when I turn it up, but that's going to be really baggy. What I need to do is I need to stretch this so that when I fold it up, the folded edge is the right size. So it feels like you're kind of doing it wrong when you do it because you're stretching it quite a bit. But when I turn that up now, you can see it lays a lot better. Obviously, when you're making something, you need to get this exactly the right size. But I just wanted to demonstrate kind of roughly how this works. So I'm just going to fiddle around with this for a second, getting that eased on a bit better because I've not done it very evenly. And then I will show you how to sew this on. And then obviously, if you're really doing this on a garment, you've got various options of how to sew it on using the various types of seam that I've shown you. You can put some top stitch on it using a cover stitch machine or a stretch stitch. There's loads of possibilities. So let's just get this sewn on so we can see how it looks. So as I said, there's various ways you can sew this on and do it decoratively, but I just wanted to add this to the end of the video, just so you've got a bit of an overview of all the steps of working with knits. So let's see if I can zoom in a little bit more. I think that's as near as I'm going to get. And I'm just sewing this right on the edge. I'm going to trim the very edge of these fabrics off because I want this seam to not be bulky. And you have to kind of pull it as you're doing it. You've obviously got one fabric that's stretched and one that's not. Now I've not measured anything here, so I'm not guaranteeing this is going to be perfectly even at all. But I just wanted to show the principle of how it works. And there you go. I've done the contrast colour so you can really see what's what, and you can see how neat that looks and how easy it was. So I've not even measured anything. I didn't check how much it was stretched. I just kind of did it by eye, and it sits really flat. So had I not stretched it, as I showed you, where that sits lovely and flat there, it would have been sticking up, and it would have, maybe not as much as this, but it wouldn't have looked great. So that's why we stretch it on. And then you can either just press it and that's it, or you can do a decorative top stitch around here. You can do a twin needle where one needle comes on either side. There are so many options you can do. So as soon as my t-shirt tutorial is done, I'll make sure there is a link to that where there'll be a lot more detail about doing the neck trim. But that is everything now that you need to know for the basic sewing techniques for using jersey and knits. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you now feel confident to go and sew some jersey fabrics. So whether you've already got a cover stitch and an overlock machine, or whether you're now thinking it's a good investment, or whether you're going to stick with a basic sewing machine, I hope you now know everything you need to know to get started sewing jersey. If there's anything that I've missed or anything that's unclear, please ask questions in the comments below and I will get back to you with as much information as I can give you. Make sure you like this video and subscribe, as I update my channel with a new tutorial every single week, and the next two after this are going to be more t-shirt ones.